I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar that the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and the Nuclear Threat Initiative are hosting today. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. It's always a pleasure to work with the Nuclear Threat Initiative and host events on updates to the NTI Nuclear Security Index or other reports and discussions. This time, unfortunately, we cannot enjoy hosting you in person in Vienna, though there is one consolation, is that the virtual format allows us to reach a much wider audience. And we have people today joining us via Zoom and through live streaming to YouTube. Let me quickly introduce our speakers today. I will have a little bit later joining us, Ambassador Laura Holgate, Nuclear Threat Initiative Vice President for Materials Risk Management. Previously, she served as a US representative to the Vienna office of the United Nations and the IAEA from July 2016 to January 2017. And those of you who are in Vienna or been here long enough, I'm sure vividly remember that time when Laura spent in Vienna. Ms. Holgate was previously the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction, Terrorism, and Threat Reduction in the U.S. National Security Council, and she was also the U.S. Sherpa to the Nuclear Security Summits. Laura also led the design and launch of Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy in November 2018. The initiative aims at increasing the presence, visibility, and impact of women in nuclear non-proliferation field, and also played a critical role in establishing the Vienna chapter of the International Gender Champions. As I mentioned, Ambassador Holgate will be joining us later, a little bit later, as we go with the webinar. The next speaker is Samantha Neakrase. She's Senior Director at NTI, also in Materials Risk Management. She leads two major projects, the NTI Nuclear Security Index that we will be discussing today, and the Global Dialogue on Nuclear Security Priorities. She has also led other projects, including cybersecurity of nuclear weapons and related systems, US-Russia relations, and nuclear weapons policy and disarmament. She also served as a research assistant for David Sanger on his book, Confront and Conceal: Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. And Jack Brosnan, Program Officer, also with NTI Risk Management, Materials Risk Management Program. He joined NTI in 2019. In his role at the Materials Risk Management Program, he supports the Nuclear Security Index and also the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Initiative. Prior to joining NTI, he served as a Deputy Executive Director of Partnership for Secure America, where he led congressional education and advocacy programs focused on nuclear security, arms control, and non-proliferation. With that introduction, I'm looking forward to today's discussion, and we'll pass our virtual microphone to Samantha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. And as I speak, Jack, I know is going to pull up some slides for us, but first I want to really echo what Elena said and thank her and the team, Artem and Noah and others for hosting us today. Elena and the Vienna Center have hosted the index launch events in the past for the previous editions of the index and have been a very kind host. And so we're obviously disappointed we can't be there with you all. And hopefully at some point soon, we'll be able to kind of connect again in person and see each other. But we're really grateful that Elena and team have welcomed us. And looking at the participants in the panel to the right, I'm seeing some familiar names, lots of new names. And so I'm pleased that so many people are interested in hearing about the index. So today's briefing is not going to be a repeat of the launch event from July 22nd, and some of you may have tuned into that virtual launch. But instead, we want to focus today on areas of the index we think are most relevant to the work being done in Vienna. So strengthening the global nuclear security architecture, institutions, treaties, etc. Jack is going to start out with a brief summary of the index methodology, and it's important to give kind of the top lines of the methodology so people can understand the results and the constraints that the index operates under. And then if we have more people want more detail about the methodology, we can go into that in the Q&A. I'm going to give some top level overview of the findings overall. And then Laura, who will join us maybe in 20 or so minutes, will then talk about some of the key areas relevant to the global nuclear security architecture, the findings and recommendations that are relevant to the Vienna community. So thanking again, Elena and team, I'm going to now turn it over to Jack.
Thank you, Samantha. So the 2020 NTI Index is the 5th edition of this unique assessment of global nuclear security conditions, the purpose of which is to promote actions that countries should take to strengthen nuclear security, to track progress on strengthening nuclear security, and to identify priorities while building accountability. The index tracks progress and provides actionable recommendations for countries to improve their own nuclear security, but also to strengthen the global nuclear security architecture. So as Samantha said, today I'm going to give a brief overview of the methodology that sits behind the index. But I also want to remind you that there's a new index website that you should all visit that contains the index report, the Excel models that contain the actual data contained in the index, and some interactive tools that are really excellent for exploring the results and recommendations contained in the index. So if you'd like to dive deeper into the methodology than what I'll be outlining today, you can also find a detailed methodology report there that explains in depth the process for the construction of the index and the considerations behind it. You can find all of those tools and much, much more at ntiindex.org. So let's begin by talking about the 3 separate rankings that make up the NTI index. First, we look at 22 countries with 1 kilogram or more of weapons usable materials, that's highly enriched uranium or plutonium, to assess the actions that they've taken to secure those materials against theft. We also look at 47 countries with nuclear facilities like nuclear power reactors and research reactors to assess the actions they've taken to protect those facilities against sabotage. And third, we look at a larger chunk of 154 countries without weapons usable nuclear materials to assess the actions they've taken to support global nuclear security efforts. All countries, even those without materials, play a vital role in building a strong global nuclear security architecture. It requires close cooperation to close gaps in material security, border detection, or criminalization that could allow terrorists to engage in nuclear terrorism. Furthermore, for countries to benefit from the peaceful uses of nuclear materials and technology, the public has to be confident that they're being used in a safe manner. Countries also benefit from the use of radioactive sources, not just nuclear materials, in settings like hospitals and universities. They can be used for life-saving therapies like targeted treatment of cancerous tissue and play really important roles in experimental research. They can also be used maliciously in a dirty bomb, though. So given the importance of addressing the dirty bomb threat, NTI also released, as part of this index for the first time, a separate assessment of radiological source security around the world. So the Radiological Source Security Assessment, it's the first of its kind, reviews the policies, commitments, and actions taken by 176 countries aimed at preventing the theft of radiological materials that could be used to build dirty bombs. So unlike the Nuclear Security Index focused on materials, facilities, and global architecture actions, the Radioactive Source Security Assessment does not score or rank countries. It's just a catalog of actions taken. So the index is a unique product that offers an objective assessment of nuclear security conditions around the world. The rigorous methodology used to develop the index is what makes it a powerful and reliable tool for governments and experts. To achieve the goal of promoting actions by countries to strengthen nuclear security, the index and its measurements have to be credible and based on an objective assessment that can be trusted to inform policy decisions. Because we want to promote action around the world and not just in the US or in the West, it's important that the index is developed with an international perspective to ensure its relevance in different countries. And finally, the index has to be transparent about its methodology and research. The credibility of the index comes from the rigorous data gathering process that's used to build it. Each edition of the index has been developed by NTI in close partnership with the Economist Intelligence Unit. The EIU has a team of researchers around the world who can review and translate publicly available information on each country's nuclear security laws, regulations, policies, and practices. The EIU gathers thousands of pieces of data and feeds them into a sophisticated data model based on a framework developed by NTI. These models, as I said, are available for download on the website, and I encourage everyone interested to take a look. During this process, the EIU only uses data that's publicly available and is objective, which in this case means it can be answered as a yes or no, or with a quantitative answer. And that can be found for every country. So it's uniform across each of the countries that it's included in the index. To ensure that the index reflects international priorities, NTI is advised by an international panel of experts. Since the first edition of the index, these experts have helped NTI and the EIU to develop the framework of questions that make up the index and to determine the relative prioritization through weighting in the scoring formula. This year's panel consists of 18 experts from 13 countries. We also received advice from a number of other experts, all of whom are listed in the report and on the website, and their contributions covered a range of subject matter expertise. Finally, it's vital that NTI and the EIU are transparent about the index methodology and research process. So at the beginning of the development process for each edition, we offer briefings to all 49 countries who have nuclear materials and/or facilities so that they understand what the index does and does not measure. That's to say, it does measure laws, regulations, and the security environment, but it does not measure on-the-ground security conditions in individual facilities. Governments can also review research results through a data confirmation process where we work with representatives of each of these governments. This helps to make the data as accurate and up to date as possible and creates opportunities for input. 27 governments participated in this year's data confirmation process for the 5th edition of the NTI Index. So with that, I will turn it back over to my colleague Samantha to talk some about the results.
Thank you, Jack. And the overview that Jack just gave, it doesn't do justice to the amount of detailed work that goes into this by the EIU and others. And so I want to stress how grateful we are to members of the international panel and the other experts we rely on and the EIU. And we're very proud of this product and hope that it's useful to all of you. So let me start, and you can see on the screen already, you may have already looked at these results, but just to give a quick overview of the top ranked and most improved countries. And here you can see the three columns for the 3 rankings that Jack mentioned. For the 5th time in a row, and there's 5 editions, so for the 5th time, Australia ranks first among countries with weapons usable nuclear materials, and also and countries with nuclear facilities. So the sabotage ranking on the far right, and the countries with materials on the far left. And it has very strong nuclear security regulations, and also is very active in efforts to strengthen the global architecture. And it also has small quantities of weapons usable nuclear materials. So sort of across the framework, it's very strong. For countries without materials, New Zealand and Sweden tie for first. And then you can see on the left that Pakistan is the most improved country with nuclear materials. And it has, over time, very dramatic improvements in its nuclear security regulations each year, in fact. And so this is really the kind of progress you hope to see, because regulatory upgrades are durable improvements and they have sustainable security benefits. It's worth noting, and because since the launch we've had these discussions with some in Pakistan, is that this is related to Pakistan's civilian materials and civilian regulations it is not relevant at all to its weapons program, and we're not measuring disarmament or non-proliferation. This is a nuclear security for civilian materials. And as mentioned, all the full details on the scores and ranks are on the index website. So I know a lot of people focus on who's ranked first and who's above which country, but that's just one part of the index. And really what we're looking for is to analyze all of this data to identify trends in nuclear security that help us understand where is progress being made, but where there's still gaps that need to be addressed, whether it's individual country actions or global actions. And the data showed us 3 major areas of concern, and I'll go through each one. But the first is that nuclear security progress has slowed significantly in the last 2 years since the last index came out. Second, domestic nuclear security regulations are not sufficiently reflective of modern threats, and this is particularly the case in critical areas like cybersecurity, insider threat prevention, and security culture. So these are 3 very important areas that are just not sufficiently addressed in regulations. And then third, the global nuclear security architecture, and that's the treaties, the institutions, the voluntary actions. There's major gaps in the architecture. And this is particularly the case among countries that don't have nuclear materials. So the first major finding I just mentioned was that progress has slowed. And not yet seeing that slide come up, but maybe you can see it. But in the charts, you can see that the data shows that the number of countries with materials that has improved their score in the index has declined. You can see from 19 countries in 2018 to 11 in 2020. And for countries without materials on that bottom chart, it has declined from 129 countries to 77. And the average score increase, which you can see in that lower line, has also gone down in both of those rankings. And this pattern you can see, and we don't have all the charts here, but you can see this pattern at the overall score level and at different category levels in the index. So you see these trend lines where things are gradually improving, but the amount of improvement has declined significantly. And this is very concerning given the backdrop that we're looking at, and that's this more complicated and unpredictable security environment with terrorist threats evolving, emerging technology, cyber in particular presenting new challenges. And then just, the world itself is facing sort of increased disorder and disruption. And so these are worrying trends. We asked ourselves, why is there this decline? And the data suggests that it's without the driving force of high-level political events like the nuclear security summits that were held between 2010 and 2016, that attention on nuclear security has waned. And the substantial improvements that were reflected in the index between 2012 and 2018, which included country actions taken in conjunction with the final summit in 2016 that were captured in the last index. But there's been no similar high-level nuclear security conferences that would drive the commitments and ambition to the same extent as the summits. And so based on this, the overall recommendation is that countries need to strengthen and sustain political attention on nuclear security. We understand there's so many competing priorities, different threats. We have a pandemic, climate change is a very big priority, but security of nuclear materials and facilities is paramount to preventing catastrophic nuclear detonation or radiological release. And then that means, as these threats expand and evolve, we have to maintain this collective commitment to address these threats. And as Jack mentioned, this is important for keeping, the ability to benefit from peaceful use of nuclear technology. We recommend that countries send high-level delegations to the IAEA's International Conference on Nuclear Security. That's been improving over the years, and use that as a forum to announce new commitments and progress. This conference that's held every 3 years and now is going to be every 4 years has been, demonstrating that it has potential to drive action, but it still can be improved. Another venue is the CPPNM, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, amended. The review conference next year is another opportunity to highlight progress and make pledges on nuclear security. On the domestic nuclear security regulations, we found that there's significant amount of work that still needs to be done to improve security. And one of the trends that we've seen is the decrease in number of countries that possess weapons usable nuclear materials has ended. That trend was a pretty strong trend during the summits, and now it has ended, and the number of countries with materials has plateaued at 22, with the most recent country eliminating its materials in 2016. In addition to the number of countries that have materials not decreasing, those that have materials, the regulatory requirements are still not comprehensive. And I mentioned briefly some areas addressing the human factor, which is insider threats and security culture, and cybersecurity. And in the case of cyber, we've seen that countries have slowly adapted to the threat, but the adoption of the requirements, which has been actually going on, is still slow and is trailing the urgency of the threat. And cyber is something that will continue to evolve quite rapidly. And so countries are not only not keeping pace with the threat, but they're lagging far behind it, and that's concerning. Every country with materials and facilities needs strong regulations, but special attention is needed in countries that are interested in acquiring nuclear technology for research or energy purposes to make sure that they have the infrastructure and the capacity to support strong nuclear security. But the index shows that 9 countries that are planning new nuclear power programs have varying levels of preparedness to take on nuclear security responsibilities. So this is an area I think our community can focus on, and making sure that countries have that capacity, and the IAEA is working on these issues, but the capacity building is very important. The third area is that there's major gaps in the global architecture, and we'll get more into this a little later, and hopefully Laura will be here to present those findings. But there's significant gaps in the global architecture. Countries without nuclear materials are not sufficiently engaged in efforts to bolster the global architecture, even though gaps in the architecture can't be closed without their participation. Also, the data shows that countries are supporting the IAEA's activities, but it still lacks the political and financial support it needs to fulfill its nuclear security mission to the greatest extent that it can, and really fulfill its what it's being asked to do in this area and what it can do. And then, except for publishing regulations, actions that countries are taking to build the confidence in nuclear security through information sharing and things like peer review still remain limited. And then finally, nuclear security INFCIRCs, information circulars, which are the newest international tool that demonstrates commitments to nuclear security. And those were the commitments that came out of the nuclear security summits, some of which then became available through this INFCIRC mechanism to all IAEA member states. Those still aren't widely used outside of the countries that have participated in the summits. They're new, and so hopefully we'll see a little bit more of an uptake in that instrument at some point in the future. Just briefly on the radioactive source security assessment, as Jack mentioned, this is the first time we have done this, and we felt that the dirty bomb threat, radiological security really hasn't been a focus, and we were sort of guessing what we would find in this area, and there's not a lot of information out there, but what we found was very concerning. the international architecture for radiological security is extremely weak, weaker than the nuclear security one, which is more evolved. But low numbers of countries are participating in international agreements and initiatives. At the national level, I would say the situation is more concerning even than that, in that most countries do not have adequate regulatory frameworks for regulating and providing oversight on radioactive sources, including lacking just very basic security requirements. And as an example, only 56% of countries have a simple basic requirement to secure radioactive sources. And the only way to really eliminate this risk posed by radioactive sources is to replace them with alternative technologies. But very, very few countries have made commitments to replace the most dangerous type of sources with alternative technology. And there's varying capacity around the world to even implement and sustain that use. And so given that radioactive sources are located, really, in many places, open environments and numerous facilities such as hospitals, research centers, they're vulnerable to theft. It could be used in a dirty bomb. The results of this first ever assessment of radiological security are great cause for concern. So I see that Laura has joined us, and I'm going to turn it to her as soon as she's ready to talk in more detail about the elements of the nuclear security architecture and how they remain weak. So I'm not sure if Laura is ready to jump in. We can welcome her.
I am ready, but my video won't turn on yet. There we go.
It just did.
There we go.
Welcome, Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Very good. Great to see you all.
You're right on time because we're about to go into the global norms category.
Excellent. Well, so I know you've gotten a great rundown from Jack and Samantha. So I'm going to dive into a portion that focuses more on the IAEA and the concerns and activities of the Vienna community in the nuclear security area. And that really falls into what we call the global norms category. And you can see on this slide that it's the third category in the index, and it has 4 indicators. First of all, international legal commitments, treaties and so on, voluntary commitments, international assurances, and for this portion, for this indicator, it only applies to countries that have nuclear materials and facilities. So as you heard earlier, that's 49 of the countries that we looked at. And then finally, nuclear security information circulars, which is a new indicator in the structure of the index this year. As you can see from this slide, the international legal commitments covers key international legal agreements, the CPPNM and its amendment, the International Convention on Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, international safeguards, and voluntary commitments covers a whole range of voluntary actions that countries can take to support international institutions and other efforts that strengthen the nuclear security architecture, such as supporting the IAEA, participating in the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction, contributing to the World Institute of Nuclear Security, and providing assistance regionally or bilaterally to other countries. We have listed, and we check 9 international voluntary activities, but the score for this indicator is capped at 6 in order to account for the fact that not all countries are equally able to take the full range of actions. And so we don't want to disadvantage those countries who may have financial or other limitations, while still giving credit to those who are contributing to the warp and weft of the international architecture. Now, international assurances covers actions that countries can take to build confidence in the security of their nuclear materials and facilities. That can include sharing information about nuclear security, It can include making declarations about quantities. It can include hosting peer reviews. This indicator is only used to assess countries with nuclear materials and/or facilities, not countries that don't have nuclear materials. Now, finally, the Nuclear Security IMCIRCs looks at how many IMCIRCs a country has subscribed to. And just to recall that the Nuclear Security IMCIRCs were a way for some of the joint commitments that were made in the context of the nuclear security summits to become available to all IAEA member states to join. Subscribing to these instruments is a way to further demonstrate a commitment to nuclear security. So our first finding in this area relates to the countries without nuclear materials are not adequately engaged in efforts to bolster the global nuclear security architecture, even though gaps in the architecture cannot be closed without the participation of all countries. And what you can see here on this slide is the data that shows that a larger percentage of countries with materials have ratified treaties and participate in international institutions and initiatives than countries without materials. Of the 66 countries that have not ratified the amended CPPNM, 62 of them are countries that don't have any materials. Of the 68 countries that have not ratified ICSANT, 64 are countries without materials. And as we have all been calling for, and as the IAEA and the United Nations have been advocating, universalization of these two critical conventions is going to require that all countries, those with as well as those without materials, ratify and implement these treaties. For those countries that fail to do so, it creates gaps in the global legal structure for interdiction, prosecution, if necessary, transfer of suspects. It really creates a problem in tightening the network that's necessary to catch nuclear materials that may be being smuggled or illicitly transferred, because the likelihood is that they will be transferred, if they're in motion, that they will be going through a country that does not have materials themselves, and therefore these treaties are critical in the criminalization components of them. The same pattern can be seen in the voluntary commitments. Only 13 of 154 countries, or 8% of countries without materials, participate in at least 6 of the 9 voluntary activities and receive a full score, compared with 16 of 22, or 73% of the countries with materials. Countries without materials receive, of countries without materials, 17% received a 0, compared with only 1 country with weapons usable nuclear materials that received a 0 in this category. So you can see there's a big difference here that we need to work on. And these are our recommendations for how to bolster this weakness. It's imperative for all countries, those with and without materials, to play a role in building a strong global architecture and closing any security gaps that would allow terrorists to engage in nuclear terrorism. Strong nuclear security enhances public confidence and will allow all countries to benefit from the peaceful uses of nuclear materials and science and technology for energy and for science. To better engage countries that don't have materials, the international community should work to build a stronger, more inclusive narrative about the importance of nuclear security to achieve broad participation in global efforts to strengthen nuclear security and increase support for the IAEA's nuclear security role. An inclusive narrative will respect different national and regional perspectives and priorities and help move away from a zero-sum approach that pits nuclear security against peaceful uses assistance. This is an all too common trend in the Vienna dialogue. A more compelling narrative will also remind countries of the link between nuclear security and support among their publics for peaceful uses of nuclear technology. This in turn as was noted in the ministerial declaration at ICONS earlier this year. And a stronger narrative would tie the importance of nuclear security to a more diverse set of national and regional priorities, so as to provide a better understanding of how nuclear security and access to peaceful uses of nuclear technology for nuclear energy, science, and research go hand in hand. The next slide shows the findings regarding the support for the International Atomic Energy Agency itself and the activities that it undertakes. The IAEA plays a central role, not only in assisting countries to reap the benefits of peaceful nuclear technology, but also coordinating and supporting countries and institutions' efforts to strengthen nuclear security. Yet data on how many countries support the IAEA activities shows that it still lacks the political and financial support it needs to fulfill its nuclear security mission. As you can see from this chart, only 22 of 176 countries have made financial or in-kind contributions to the IAEA Nuclear Security Fund in the last 2 years. A greater percentage of countries with materials than of countries without materials contributes to the Nuclear Security Fund. Not all countries can make financial contributions to the Nuclear Security Fund, but there are other ways to support the IAEA's nuclear security mission. Participating in the IAEA's International Conference on Nuclear Security, or ICONS, at a high level is an action that all countries can take to demonstrate their support for the IAEA and for turning ICONS into a platform for progress and commitments. Yet last year, only 53 countries sent a minister to the most recent ICONS. Ministerial representation is greater among countries with materials than countries without materials, continuing the pattern that we've seen. Participation in the incident and trafficking database is strong among both countries with materials and countries without materials, with 134 countries participating. This is a really high and strong figure, and it creates the opportunity for the IAEA to track incidents of illicit trafficking of nuclear and radiological materials. And the more countries that participate, the more effective and comprehensive this tracking system will be. And finally, 76 countries participate in the Nuclear Security Guidance Committee. And participation is stronger here, as it is in other areas, among countries with materials than countries without materials. So how can we do better to support the IAEA? Given its important role in nuclear security, countries should increase their financial and political support for the agency by contributing to the Nuclear Security Fund or supporting and participating in IAEA activities. They should reduce the number of conditions, in addition to increasing donations and contributions to the Nuclear Security Fund. Countries and donors should reduce the number of conditions placed on these funds so that the IAEA has more flexibility as it prioritizes its resources and engages in long-term planning. All countries, including countries without materials, should strive to be represented by ministers or their equivalent at the next ICONS in 2024. And all countries should participate in and actively report incidents to the International Incident and Trafficking Database to close the coverage gap in the IAEA's ability to track incidents of illicit tracking of nuclear and radiological materials around the world. And at a minimum, all countries with nuclear materials and facilities should become members of the Nuclear Security Guidance Committee. Doing so will boost the status of the IAEA's nuclear security guidance, potentially leading to broader adoption and implementation of the guidance and strengthening nuclear security implementation around the world. Countries without nuclear materials should also participate because they too have a stake in strong, effective nuclear security guidelines that all states follow, given that weaknesses in nuclear security in one country can always affect others. To address perceptions that the IAEA's nuclear security activities pull resources away from technical cooperation, the IAEA should do more itself to build greater awareness of how its nuclear security activities support countries' peaceful uses of nuclear technology. This effort can include greater transparency by the IAEA on how countries support and participate in activities such as the ITDB, the Nuclear Security Guidance Committee, and the IAEA's International Physical Protection Advisory Service missions. One way to build awareness is to highlight how individuals around the world benefit from nuclear security and from the IAEA's assistance daily. Our third major finding under global norms is on international assurances or confidence building, which in the index only applies to the 49 countries with weapons usable nuclear materials or nuclear facilities. Every country has an interest in knowing that other countries are effectively securing their nuclear materials and facilities, given that an act of nuclear terrorism will have a negative impact on us all. Yet, except for publishing regulations, actions to build confidence in nuclear security through information sharing and peer review remain limited. Almost all of the 49 countries publish their nuclear security regulations. As you can see here, 45 countries do so. In addition, of these 49 countries, 28 publish an annual nuclear security report. Publishing regulations and annual reports about nuclear security provides useful information about how a country is implementing nuclear security and builds confidence in the country's nuclear security practices. Also positive is that 33 out of the 49 countries, 2/3, have made a public declaration about their nuclear security progress in the last 2 years, in conjunction with international, multilateral, or regional nuclear security conferences. Another 9 countries made declarations previously, but have not done so recently. Regularly making public declarations about nuclear security progress at international, multilateral, and regional conferences on nuclear security, such as ICONs, for example, demonstrates commitment to nuclear security progress and underscores the need for continuous improvement in nuclear security. When it comes to transparency around material stocks, both civilian and military, however, the results are much less positive. Transparency around stocks of materials increases confidence that materials are properly accounted for and enables governments and non-government organizations to track global inventories. It is possible to share information about material stocks while also protecting sensitive information. Yet only 10 countries with nuclear materials, fewer than half, have made public declarations or reports about civilian nuclear materials since January 1st, 2019. China has made declarations before that date. 11 countries have never made any declarations about their civilian material stocks. Norway and Australia are the only 2 countries that have made a declaration of civilian stocks of highly enriched uranium using IAEA Information Circular 912, which is based on a joint commitment made in the 2016 Nuclear Security Summit. Many other countries can do more. The record on military materials is even worse, with only 2 of the 9 countries with nuclear weapons, in this case, the United States and the United Kingdom, have made any declarations about their military stocks. Another important confidence building activity is peer review. Peer reviews build confidence and demonstrate a commitment to nuclear security and continuous improvement. Although 27 of 49 countries with materials or facilities have hosted an IAEA IPAS mission, only 11 of those have done so in the past 5 years. 17 countries have never hosted an IPAS mission or follow-up mission, and 10 countries have never had a nuclear security peer review of any type from the IAEA or otherwise. 5 countries, Australia, Canada, Japan, Norway, and Sweden, have taken the extra confidence building step of publishing the results of an IPAS mission in the last 5 years, which builds confidence that they are taking remedial actions to strengthen their nuclear security. So our recommendations regarding confidence building is that there's more steps that need to be taken, including improving transparency around stocks and increasing participation in peer reviews. First of all, we recommend that countries should publish nuclear security regulations and annual reports. Most countries do this, but more should be doing it. Countries should also regularly make public declarations about the nuclear security progress, whether in speeches at multilateral events or other statements, including at ICONs. Countries should increase transparency around material stocks, both military and civilian, including through IMCIRC 912 for civilian HEU and IMCIRC 549 for civilian HEU and separated plutonium. All countries with nuclear materials and/or nuclear facilities should host IPAS missions or other bilateral or multilateral peer review, including follow-up missions every 5 years. And countries should publish summaries of peer reviews. Countries can also support IPAS missions by lending their expertise. Experts on IPAS missions come from member states. These are not done by the IAEA staff. To support increased demand for IPAS missions, countries should send their experts to receive IAEA training, to serve on the mission teams, and then encourage their experts to participate in those missions. Finally, an additional way to build confidence that is included in a different part of the index is to submit information to the IAEA under Article 14 of the amended CPPNM, which requires submission of information on laws and regulations that give effect to the treaty. Only 59 countries have submitted this information to the IAEA, even though this is a legal requirement of the treaty. It would be great if next year's review conference would mark 100% compliance with this important legal provision. The next findings relate to the information circulars. Now, subscribing to these circulars demonstrates commitment to nuclear security, and it helps raise nuclear security standards globally, but they're still not that widely used beyond countries that participated in the nuclear security summits. Only 39 countries have subscribed to Information Circular 869, which includes commitments to implementing IAEA nuclear security guidelines, guidance, continuous improvement, and demonstrable competence. Only 36 countries have subscribed to 3 or more of the 9 other nuclear security IMCIRCs included in the index. 9 additional countries have subscribed to 2, and 5 countries have subscribed to just 1. Overall, 50 countries have subscribed to 1 or more of nuclear security IMCIRCs other than 869. We believe that countries should subscribe to these IMCIRCs to demonstrate commitment to nuclear security and help raise nuclear security standards globally. Countries should subscribe to IMCIRC 869, which will help raise the prominence of IAEA's nuclear security guidance through a voluntary pledge to implement that guidance through a nation's own national regulatory processes. This is the most important aspect of the nuclear security implementation, is what happens on the ground in a particular country. More work is needed to promote these instruments so that countries understand how they can be used to promote continuous nuclear security improvements. Before we go to the Q&A, I just want to briefly mention how I interacted with the index when I was in government. During the 7 years I spent working at the White House, leading President Obama's efforts on nuclear security and the nuclear security summits, I received briefings on each edition of the index and coordinated the US government participation in the data confirmation process that you heard about earlier. I also used the index to identify priorities within the nuclear security summit process and to inform the assistance the US government would offer to other countries to help them improve. It also supported our bilateral talks with other governments on nuclear security and helped shape our overall policies. So I would encourage those of you who hold government positions to explore the results in depth via the interactive tools on the website and the downloadable Excel models. The information there will help you identify actions you can take within your own country to improve your own laws and regulations and thereby improve your score, and to understand where global architecture needs more work and attention. It could also inform partnerships and relationships with other countries or with institutions such as the World Institute of Nuclear Security, whether through best practice development and exchanges, peer reviews, or other types of cooperation. Used in this way, the index can be an extremely valuable tool for governments. With that, we're eager to answer your questions. And as a reminder, you can visit www.ntiindex.org to download the report, the full data sets, and play with all the interactive tools available on the website and in the Excel models to explore the results. I see that we posted in the chat the link to receive a print copy of the report as well. So with that, we look forward to a rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Samantha and Jack, for your very comprehensive overview of the results of this edition of the NTI Nuclear Security Index, but also particularly for the recommendations about the improvements. Just want to remind our listeners and viewers that we have a little bit more than 30 minutes left for Q&As, which is great. I would also remind those who are joining us via Zoom, please use Q&A function to ask your questions rather than using the hand, because that's the way we will do the, I will read out the question and ask panelists. Also, if you have questions to specific panelists, please indicate it as well, but I understand you, the three of you will be able to decide among yourself who wants to answer it. For those who are watching on YouTube, please send your questions to events@vcdnp.org. With that, I already have a number of questions that came to you, and some of the questions that, well, first of all, one of the questions I find it's very interesting is the one related to, first of all, in the absence of nuclear security summits, what forums and actions would you recommend to increase global attention to the need for continued progress on nuclear security? That question came from Bill Moon, nuclear security consultant at the Stimson Center. Then while you were thinking about it, maybe I'll pose a couple of other questions and then we'll take another round. There's also a question from William Janssens, where he asked what you can say about the impact, possibly also on the index itself, the nuclear or the nuclear security preparedness level, and whether how you assess that in assessing how countries participate in various nuclear security related exercises and how they collaborate with each other internationally or regionally. So that's kind of a shortened version of that question. And the third question that I would like to throw in right away is for you to think about whether you looked at not only the cyber challenges, which I knew, but at the other potentially new or disruptive technologies, particularly drones and their possible measures to lower the risks that they could be used to cause harm to nuclear facilities. So with these three questions, I think we're ready to hear some answers. Who would like to go first? Laura, I see you smiling. Okay, go ahead.
I'll take the first question about the venues for leadership and driving action, because to me, that was really the hallmark of the summits, was the expectation that participants would come with specific progress to characterize and describe and take credit for. The icons has the potential to do that. And we started to see that a little bit more this year than previous years, where not only attend at a ministerial level, but make sure that the ministers have something new to say, a new pledge or a characterization of a project completed, or a recognition of new regulations or a new ratification. Maybe that's the point where a country submits its ratification information. There's a lot that ICONS can do as a near universal entity and moment for countries to demonstrate senior level leadership and to make sure those leaders come with commitments and pledges and action. And so that requires, kind of peer pressure among countries. And so those countries who are very committed to nuclear security advocacy can use that in their bilateral advocacy with other countries to say, hey, my minister's coming. I really hope you'll bring your minister and you'll bring commitments that are made, that you want to make in this public context to get credit for what you're doing. There are other instances on the calendar in which these senior level commitments can be seen. There are ministerial level meetings of the global partnership, as well as the global initiative. There are occasional meetings in New York convened as high-level meetings. In fact, I think there's one that's in planning for the International Convention on Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terror. Those are also opportunities to send high-level officials and make public commitments. The IAEA General Conference is an annual moment. We usually have ministers that attend. The content of their statements are always public, and it's a chance for people to make pledges and to be recognized for progress made. So I think there's a lot of venues that can be made good use of. There's nothing that prevents the convening of summits in the future. There was at one point a statement by Indian Prime Minister Modi that he would host a summit on WMD terrorism, a broader, a different frame. That has yet to happen. But if there is a consensus or a feeling among leaders that a return to some leader level meetings would be valuable, then any leader can take that up and promote that as an initiative. So I think there's lots of ways to continue the momentum if states decide to use them.
Thank you, Laura. The next question.
Yep, I'm happy to take the next question on exercises. So this gets to the issue of, acknowledging the fact that countries are going to have nuclear materials and nuclear facilities far into the future. And so we need to focus on kind of the long-term sustainability of nuclear security. And a big part of that is the human factor and ensuring that there's a skilled and trained, competent workforce and that the country has the capacity to implement nuclear security in the long term. And so you can think about, university programs, training programs, exchanges, best practice exchanges, et cetera. And the exercises that Willem is referring to, those are just one type of activity that helps to improve capacity and skills over time. And we, because this is such an important area, we did look at how to incorporate this into the index. And both in terms of, are there educational programs, training programs, et cetera? Can we look at which countries participate in exercises or workshops, including things like the WINS workshops, or how many people is a country sending to the WINS Academy for certification? And because the index it's something where you can't have everything that's important in the index because the methodology is very strict. You have to be able to find data that's public information, and that you can find, feel reasonably confident that you can find that information for every country. And in cases like courses at universities, or whether a country has sent people to be part of an exercise, that information is very, very difficult to come by. It's not necessarily public. If it is public, it's uneven across countries. And so ultimately, we decided to not include those specific questions as indicators, but sort of in general, talk about the importance of capacity building, competence, skills, skilled workforce, et cetera. So this is an area that's really important. So as we go through future indexes, we may revisit and see if there's any way to incorporate more in this area into the index. But for now, we did look at it, but weren't able to develop a question related to it.
Thank you, Samantha. Just as a little bit of a clarification question to that. Maybe you covered it, but I missed it. Did you count into the index ratings and scores that you had participation by countries in various other initiatives, like the Global Initiative combating nuclear terrorism, or say RERTR program, HEU minimization efforts like fuel replacement, just to say a few words about that.
Yeah, so I can just tell you in terms of the voluntary actions, we looked at whether countries are members of the Global Initiative, so that's one. Also the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction, whether they contribute to the World Institute for Nuclear Security, whether they make contributions to the IAEA's Nuclear Security Fund. One that's a little bit more fuzzy is whether countries have provided or received bilateral or multilateral assistance. So that kind of gets to the capacity building piece, both in terms of supporting capacity building, but also engaging it. We also look at whether a country hosts a center of excellence or nuclear security support center. Again, that gets to the capacity building. We also talked about the various IAEA related questions, the ICONs, the Incident Trafficking Database, the Nuclear Security Guidance Committee. And then we also look at the peer review is a place where we look at whether countries are engaging in those, but we only look at the ones that are specific to nuclear security. So we exclude things related to reactor technology or safety or other initiatives like that. So that's the kind of layout of what we include.
I think in connection with the RERTR or HU minimization issue, Elena, we catch that behavior in the size or presence of HEU in a country, but we don't track whether or not they participate in a conference on those topics, for example.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And now to the question about the other than cyber threats emerging, including drones and maybe others.
Maybe I'll just say one thing,
Sure.
and then so yeah, obviously there's so much, fast evolutions in various technologies, and we don't have specific questions about technologies other than cyber, but we do have a question that asks about whether countries' design basis threat is regularly updated. And the DBT is where you're going to find the need to keep up and update the threats against which a nuclear facility must protect against, with these evolving threats like drones and other threats. And so it's very important that countries not only have a DBT, but that it's regularly updated. And then that is what the security regulator is looking at, measuring the security of the facilities against that DBT. So that, to me, that's sort of where it's covered, but we can't kind of address every single new technology. Cyber just happens to be a major area that is gradually getting attention in regulations. But also it's really hard to keep up in a regulatory sense with technology, because the pace of technology change is faster than the pace at which countries can regulate. And so as soon as the regulation is passed, it's sort of obsolete already. So that has to be taken into account as well.
Thank you, Samantha. If there are no other additions, I will go into second kind of round of questions, if you don't mind. So one is coming, I believe, from George Moore regarding whether you see any potential for an international agreement covering radioactive materials and sources, as opposed to currently a kind of voluntary code of conduct and other measures. And if so, would you see such an agreement? How would you see this agreement or negotiations developing? Then there is also a question coming from Ingrid Kirsten from VDCNP. And before I ask it, I also want to mention that one of the items that that you have addressed in your presentation is how we can find more congruence between the expansion of peaceful uses of nuclear materials and technologies and nuclear security, and how we can engage more countries that even don't have nuclear materials in supporting nuclear security architecture and governance. Wanted to mention that Ingrid and the VDCNP particularly are leading a series of projects related to peaceful uses and their applications, demonstrating their benefits, but also in a sustainable way, which includes having a robust nuclear security. And for those who are watching, you can peruse our website for a number of fact sheets that have been provided earlier. But the question from Ingrid relates to the note that Samantha mentioned about one of the ways to improve nuclear security is to replace radioactive sources with alternative technologies. And the question is, how can countries commit to this if viable alternative technologies are not available to all applications? And where those technologies are available, the challenge for many developing countries is that they do not have the infrastructure and training available to support such technologies. And there has been a US Homeland Security white paper that speaks to this in 2019, as well as other technical reports by the IAEA. And now we'll leave it at this, and while I'm monitoring for additional questions. So first on the potential for the international agreement on rare sources and materials.
Yeah, I'll take these on the radioactive sources issues. First of all, I'm quite skeptical about the potential to transform the code of conduct or any other approach into a treaty. And it's very difficult to get treaties negotiated right now. And it's less about whether or not a treaty would be useful and more about where should we be putting our time and energy. We have the code of conduct. We know what to do. The question is really, how can we all work together to apply it to our own countries and to support its acceptance and implementation in other countries. And if I had to put my diplomatic and implementation effort in a treaty versus an implementation of the code of conduct, I would put it in the code of conduct every day. At some point in the future, there may be value in a treaty, but I think we recognize from the CPP&M, we're not going to get a treaty that has a monitoring capacity in this space. And so there's a lot of, it's not clear what additional benefit would come from a legally binding treaty over the code of conduct. And And we might actually lose ground from the code of conduct if you try to turn it into something that's legally binding. So I think we really ought to focus on the broadening of the acceptance and the implementation of what we have, and then as well as on the universalization and implementation of the treaties that we have. On the alternative technology, of course, Ingrid is absolutely right. This is why we looked at in the index at what the capacity might be in certain countries to accept certain types of alternative technologies. You know, when it comes to cesium alternative technologies, a significant number of those are readily available and not significantly more expensive and are actually easier to operate if you move to an X-ray machine for certain kind of irradiators. The cobalt-60 in teletherapy machines is, as Ingrid points out, much more complicated. And so this is why we're really glad to see various efforts to make linear accelerators, which are the common substitute for those cobalt-60 machines, more affordable, more appropriate for the technical and infrastructure environments in a broader number of countries. And I think the IAEA can do more on this through the Nuclear Applications Program. I think it's also important to recognize that the IAEA, in the conversations that happen usually in the Technical Cooperation Department, can include people and should be including people from the Nuclear Security Department and from the Nuclear Applications Department in the conversations with countries that have a certain need for applications of high activity radiological sources, to talk about not only what the benefits could be, but then what the challenges and long-term downsides might be, and to be sure that if a country decides nonetheless to proceed with a high activity radiological source based technology, that the agency is also providing the necessary resources and training for the adequate security of that technology. And in fact, I would advocate that it should be important that the recipient country have accepted the code of conduct on radiological source security. So I think there's a lot that the agency can do, both to make alternative technology more accessible, but also where alternative technology isn't possible, to make sure that provision of access to the benefits of radiological sources does not increase risks of malicious use and dangers to populations.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you also, our VCDNP staff posting a link to some of our fact sheets.
You guys are doing great work on that.
Thank you. And I don't see other questions coming that are. There is one question, but not related to nuclear security, or some really, really technical questions. Maybe I can ask you a couple of questions, and while others are working, sending their questions. One question that I would really like to hear your thoughts about. You pointed to a very low reporting by countries of their stocks, including both civilian and military stocks. And what we can do about it to improve it. What are the ways to really focus on this issue? Because I think it's important for nuclear security. It is also extremely important for overall non-proliferation, arms control, disarmament issues, the whole nuclear global governance. And I think it's also an extremely valuable transparency tool within the NPT. But what we can do, what are the suggestions, how we can improve on that? That's one. And second, maybe kind of a suggestion, a comment from me regarding the adherence to the INFCIRCs that came out of the nuclear security summits. If I were thinking about why there are so few countries that have joined it afterwards, there was initial kind of rise in the numbers who joined it, and then a bit of a pause, which is a little bit too long by now. Would it be useful to have more of an outreach, some kind of specific campaign to actually educate countries on these INFCIRCs? Because I know when something becomes just a number 869 or whatever, the attention is not always there. So what we can do to improve in these two areas?
I'll start on the first one, and Samantha will probably have some additional things to add, and then I'll let her take the INFCIRC question. I think when it comes to military materials, I think it really has to be a peer pressure situation. I think the logic of it is apparent, but it's not shared by those who are not reporting. And I can tell you from my efforts when I was in government to get other P5 countries, for example, who have military materials to follow some of the same steps that the US government has followed, that it was very contrary to their political culture, to their sense of what added to or subtracted from nuclear security. There is a very significant perception among some of the P5 that saying even total quantities of material increases the risk to that material. So that has to be taken seriously. These are not frivolous positions. And so I really think it has to happen among those countries that have military material. They need to be having those conversations among themselves. And I think the P5 process is an excellent place to include this conversation where there can be a serious discussion. It doesn't have to be done exactly the same in each country, but I think that there are steps that each country can take to be both more visible about their stocks and about the nuclear security measures.
Oh, we lost you for a second. Okay, you're back.
The US government has made several statements about the security of US military material, including at the Nuclear Security Summit. And then we made a pledge at the final summit to report on security of military nuclear material through our 1540 reporting. We haven't mentioned that, but that's certainly an important tool by which transparency can be offered to other countries, and each country can define, what they say in the report. So it's, each country has the choice of what they say. There's no one can be forced to release classified or sensitive information. But that's a tool that countries can update whenever they wish, and that other countries could provide. So I really think that it starts in the P5 and then maybe flows out from there. But that's where I would really like to see some effort on the military materials issue.
Thank you so much. And on the INFCIRCs, Samantha?
Yeah, and let me just add a couple things on the materials as well. So on the military side, and Laura's right that this has to be a kind of P5-led effort, but I would note that with the NPT review conference coming up, there is an opportunity as the P5 look for ways to exhibit good behavior and living up to commitments. That type of transparency, both on the security side, but also on the quantity side, and we're stressing this is aggregate quantities. We're not looking at this location or that location. This is an aggregate kind of declaration. But the NPT venue is a place where that could happen. I think there's strong incentive for the P5 to to exhibit good behavior, and then pressure could be applied. I also think that milestone events like icons and other venues are really good places to apply that pressure and expectation of that transparency. They're on civilian side as well. And there are tools, MCIRC 912 on HEU, MCIRC 549, which is for plutonium, but also has been used by some countries for the civilian HEU. And I think that using these milestone events like icons is another way to also, for countries with materials, to show, we're not asking countries without materials to do all these things, and then we're kind of not doing everything we can. I think it really helps for all countries that have materials to be demonstrating this, responsible behavior and transparency, and that I think increases goodwill and a sense of we're all kind of part of this community. We're all working together. So I think there's some, again, like the peer pressure and expectations and milestones helps with that. On MCIRCs, as I said, these are such new tools. And apart from MCIRC 869, these came out at the end of, I think, 2016. And so there just really hasn't been a lot of focus on getting more subscribers beyond the Nuclear Security Contact Group, which has been doing a little bit of that. But I think that, again, these milestone events are these opportunities to promote these instruments and promote, why it's important for countries to subscribe. They demonstrate commitment. There's a lot of countries that do want to exhibit good behavior. They do want to demonstrate commitment. They're looking for ways to show leadership. And I think if there were more awareness of what these instruments do, there could be more uptake among the countries who really, they're at icons. There are countries that don't have materials, and they were making really strong statements. They were really demonstrating good behavior and responsibility and leadership. And this is one way to do it. We have seen, I put in the chat, I'm looking at my paper because I have a count here. We have 4 countries that were not in the summits that have subscribed to one or more of these instruments, and additional subscriptions by summit countries after the summits. So there is some activity, but the outreach is key. And I think the outreach at these milestone events, I would have loved to see in the ministerial declaration just to mention that these instruments exist. I mean, it was too ambitious probably, but some recognition that these instruments exist. Some of the countries' ministerial the statements that they made did say that they had subscribed, and so they were demonstrating it and sort of saying that they had done that as a part of their progress, and that was really good. So we need to see more of that at different venues.
Thank you, Samantha. And I think we are almost run out of time to end our seminar, but I'll ask a very quick question that you can probably answer is yes or no. That question comes from Valeria Lozova. And the question is, when you were working on your indexing of various regulatory frameworks in the countries, did you include only laws that were specifically dedicated to nuclear security, or did you also account for broader security laws?
We were narrowly focused on nuclear security. So as a good example of this is in the cybersecurity area, a lot of countries do have broad policies on cybersecurity of critical infrastructure and other things. But because we really want the focus to be on nuclear security, we need to have that focus and attention on this specific topic, on this specific threat. We only gave credit to, again, this example of cyber regulations that required or were related to nuclear facilities and what they were doing to protect nuclear materials and facilities and all these sort of digital systems that impact the physical security from cyber attacks. And across the board, that's what we were looking for. There's lots of activity on other security issues, on nuclear safety and other areas, and nuclear security is often kind of left behind, or second thought to some of these other areas. And so focusing on nuclear security is a way to really promote action in that area and promote attention on that particular threat and the actions to reduce that threat.
Okay, I think that's probably gonna be it for today. I really appreciate Laura, Samantha, and Jack, you making your time available today, and yourself to give an overview of the latest edition of the NTI Nuclear Security Index. I really am impressed, as always, with the rigor of the analysis and all the recommendations that come out of this important work. Thank you also for your additional thoughts about improving nuclear security, both at the global level architecture and some of the issues that we look more on kind of domestic national level, and for your great answers to the questions that were posed. And many other participants are all sending you regards and appreciate in general the work you guys do in nuclear security. So with that, I would like to wish everyone who is attending our webinar today to stay safe and healthy, and for our participants to the same, but also with keeping up their important work. And I dearly hope that not that far into the future, we can host you back in Vienna again in person. That would be so lovely. With that, thank you everyone, and have a nice day or morning or evening, depending on where you joined us from. All the best.